This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 5, Writing, Literacy, and Society. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the definition of literacy. So, to begin, we'll start by defining what we mean when we're talking about literacy. As we said in the first video of this module, literacy is the ability to read and write in a language. This is probably a concept that we are all very familiar with. It's a skill that is critical to function in our society. In fact, you're using your skill of literacy right now. That's a testament to that fact. And a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, literacy is an indication of a country's development. That's how critical the skill of literacy is. And of course, this means that the issue of not being able to read is very significant as well. So of course, illiteracy is also a major issue. To illustrate just how important literacy actually is to our society, just think in the course of your day, even just today, think of how many times you have either written something, typed something, or read something. And you'll find that it's a skill that you use constantly throughout the day. One area where writing is very frequently used, which we're using right now, is through education. So writing is very significant for that. Writing is also critical for legal functions and for government functions. For example, dealing with a government office or paying your taxes both requires you to be able to be literate. Writing is also culturally significant. Being literate means you're allowed to access literature and access cultural works. Writing is also very important for historical records and maintaining our own understanding of the past. Writing is also important for business functions. Writing is used in business all the time. And also, writing is used for a social function. Being able to communicate with your friends or family members oftentimes takes place in the medium of writing, not only within speech. And you may even be able to think of other ways besides these 6 that I've listed here. But I hope the point here is very clear, that writing is a very significant skill that someone needs to have. If someone is not literate in a society like ours, they are significantly disadvantaged. And this is why the technology of writing is so critical for society. So first of all, it's important to note that literacy is not something that is a binary concept. There aren't just people who are literate or illiterate. Literacy, we can say, exists on a spectrum, and there are varying degrees that someone can be able to read. So because there's this kind of variation, we have come up with this term called functional literacy, which is the particular degree that an individual needs to have in order to be able to function in a society. So in order to be functionally literate, this would mean you have the literacy necessary to be able to read educational materials and to be able to function in your education system, to be able to read official documents, for example, your taxes or legal documents, things of that nature, and also being able to read material that is required for your job. So many jobs, maybe even most jobs in our society, require the ability to read and write. And so there's a very strong economic impact of literacy. The ability to actually become functionally literate is actually a very difficult skill. It requires a lot of training. And it's important to note when we're talking about functional literacy, or even any kind of literacy, that it takes many, many years of training to actually develop these skills. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about literacy in this module. And one reason is that oftentimes when you are learning to become functionally literate, you have to learn to become literate in a particular register of your language. So what's a register? Well, a register is a variety of language used for a particular purpose or a situation. So for example, the legalese is a kind of term that we might use for the kind of language used in legal documents. And the way that the kind of language we see in a legal document is very different from the way that we speak with our friends and family, or the things that we might find in literature, or things like that, for example. And so the kind of language that is actually used in legalese is very different and actually has to be taught. You have to learn certain kinds of vocabulary to be able to actually use them. And academic writing is another example of this. Being able to read textbooks or read research papers also requires a particular kind of literacy. So this kind of goes to show that becoming functionally literate is really something that requires a lot of training. So to kind of give an illustration of this, of legalese, we might see a sentence like, in witness whereof the parties hereunto have set their hands in these presents as a deed on the day, month, and year hereinbefore mentioned. So that's kind of a very complicated and convoluted sentence. We could probably translate this from legalese to English by saying, please sign along with the day, month, and year. So we can say that these are two sentences which kind of convey the same meaning, and they're both in English, but they're in two very different registers. And so, becoming functionally literate requires you to be able to learn these kinds of registers. And additionally, becoming literate or functionally literate often requires you to learn a standard language. As linguists, we probably, as many of you are, you probably know that all languages contain variations in their vocabulary and pronunciation. However, this can kind of be detrimental when we're talking about a writing system that an entire country uses. So oftentimes, a government or a speech community will select one particular variety of the language and mandate that as the standard language. And we can define a standard language as the language variety used for public communication. And in order to become literate, oftentimes you have to learn this standard language. And that standard language might be very different from the language that you speak in day-to-day life. It might even be a completely different language entirely. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about literacy too. It might involve actually learning a language like this. And these kinds of languages can actually be legislated, if you will. They can be created by an institution. Sometimes these changes can be instituted by a government. So we can, for example, the People's Republic of China has significant control over how the Chinese language is used. There are also institutions like the Académie Française, which is an independent institution not attached to any government, but it is still the main body that is responsible for the standardization and of the French language. And also, there are organizations such as Merriam-Webster, which are actually private organizations. So these are organizations which also try to keep up to date with modern vocabulary and adjudicate between correct spelling and the correct usage of the language. One interesting thing that we can consider language or standard languages to be is that, in a way, they're a kind of language technology. So remember, at the beginning of this course, we were talking about a technology as something that is artificial and is used to augment human abilities. In this way, since standard languages are regulated in this way, we can say that they are artificial, and therefore that they're a kind of technology. So this is kind of an interesting aspect to think about. So to conclude what we talked about in this lesson, we defined literacy as the ability to read and write. We've talked about how it is critical for society and in the ways that it is critical. We've talked about how it is not a black and white skill. It's not something that you either have or don't. There are many different levels of literacy that you can have. and we've named the level for which you are able to function in your society. We've called that functional literacy. And this is a very important topic to know about. We talked about how literacy is a difficult skill. It requires years of training to actually become literate. So it is not an easy issue to tackle. And we've talked about reasons why it's difficult. It's difficult because it might involve you learning a standard language, which might be very different from the language you usually speak at home or with your community. And also, you are required to learn how to use the appropriate register of your language. So it's not enough just to learn how to read the words that you can speak. You also have to know what variety of a language is used in legal documents in order to actually function in the legal system, for example, and also to learn how academic language is used to function in the educational system. So for these two reasons, developing the skill of literacy and functional literacy are actually very difficult, and these will become key issues as we go forward in this module.